The contractions started just as the first snowflakes began to fall, and Clara Dawson knew with a sinking certainty that this baby was coming tonight, whether anyone was ready or not. She gripped the edge of the kitchen table in their small homestead outside Idaho City, Idaho, breathing through the pain while her husband Richard paced by the door, his face pale and his hands shaking as he pulled on his coat. It was December of 1876, and the wind already howled like a wild animal against the wooden walls. "Richard, please," Clara gasped, her dark hair plastered to her forehead with sweat despite the cold creeping through the cracks. "You cannot leave me now. The baby is coming." Her husband would not meet her eyes. He had never been good with difficult things, with blood or pain or responsibility that weighed too heavy. "I have to get the doctor from town. You said yourself we would need him when the time came. The storm is getting worse." Clara's voice broke as another contraction seized her, stealing her breath. "You will never make it through. Please, Richard, please stay with me." But he was already opening the door, letting in a blast of freezing air and swirling snow. "I will be back soon with help. Just hold on." The door slammed behind him, and Clara heard the horse whinny in protest before the sound of hoofbeats faded into the screaming wind. She was alone. Completely alone in a cabin miles from the nearest neighbor, with her first child trying to force its way into the world during what was shaping up to be one of the worst blizzards Idaho had seen in years. Clara sank to her knees on the rough wooden floor, tears streaming down her face as fear and pain and betrayal warred inside her chest. How could he leave her like this? How could the man she had married, the man who had promised to love and protect her, abandon her in her most desperate hour? The contractions were coming faster now, each one a wave of agony that left her gasping. Clara managed to crawl toward the bed, pulling herself up onto the quilt her mother had made before she died. She had no idea what to do, no knowledge of childbirth beyond the vague things women whispered about. Her mother had planned to be here for this, but consumption had taken her 6 months ago. Richard's mother lived back east and had made it clear she thought her son had married beneath him when he chose a homesteader's daughter. Clara screamed as another contraction tore through her, and the sound was swallowed by the howling storm. No one would hear her. No one would come. She was wrong. Matthew Reeves had been riding toward Idaho City when the storm hit, and he knew immediately he had made a mistake leaving so late in the day. The cattle buyer he had been meeting with had kept him talking too long, and now he was paying the price. The snow was coming down so thick he could barely see his horse's ears, and the temperature had dropped until his breath came out in frozen clouds. He needed shelter, and he needed it fast, or he would freeze to death out here. When he spotted the small homestead through the white curtain of snow, relief flooded through him. Matthew guided his horse toward the cabin, noting the thin line of smoke from the chimney. Someone was home. He dismounted and was about to knock when he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold, even colder than the wind already had. A woman was screaming. Matthew did not hesitate. He threw open the door and stumbled inside, snow following him in a flurry. The cabin was small and sparsely furnished, but warm compared to the brutal cold outside. His eyes immediately found the woman on the bed, her face contorted in pain, her dress soaked with sweat and something else. Blood. There was blood. "Madam." Matthew crossed to her in 3 long strides, his boots leaving puddles of melting snow on the floor. "Madam, what is happening? Where is your husband?" Clara's eyes flew open, wild with pain and fear. For a moment she thought the cold and agony had made her delirious, conjuring this tall stranger with snow melting in his dark hair and concern etched across his weathered face. "He left," she managed to say between gasps. "Gone for the doctor. But the baby, it is coming now. Right now. Matthew felt his stomach drop. He was a cowboy, a ranch hand who had spent the last 15 years of his life since he was 17 working cattle and breaking horses. He had delivered calves and foals, pulled breech lambs from struggling ewes, but a human baby. That was entirely different territory. Still, as he looked at this woman's terrified face, he knew he had no choice. "All right," he said, forcing his voice to stay calm even though his heart was hammering. "All right, we are going to get through this together. My name is Matthew. What is yours?" "Clara," she sobbed. "Clara Dawson. Please, I do not know what to do. I am so scared." Matthew shrugged off his heavy coat and rolled up his sleeves, moving to the stove to put water on to boil because that was what people always did in situations like this, was it not? His mind raced, pulling up every memory of every birth he had witnessed, trying to translate animal instinct into human care. "Clara, I am not going to lie to you. I have never done this before with a person. But I have brought more creatures into this world than I can count, and the basics are probably the same. Your body knows what to do. We just have to help it along." Another contraction hit, and Clara screamed, her hands fisting in the quilt. Matthew returned to her side, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he helped her into a better position. "When the pain comes, you need to push with it. Do not fight it. Work with your body, not against it." The hours that followed were the longest of Matthew's life. The storm raged outside, piling snow against the windows until the world beyond the cabin ceased to exist. Inside, Clara labored with a courage that left Matthew in awe. She pushed when he told her to push, breathed when he said to breathe, and though tears streamed down her face and she cried out in agony, she never gave up. Matthew talked to her through all of it, his deep voice steady and reassuring. He told her about the ranch where he worked, about the foal he had saved just last spring that everyone said would not make it. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about the first time he had seen the mountains of Idaho and known he had found home. He talked to keep her focused, to keep himself from panicking, to fill the cabin with something other than the sounds of pain and the howling wind. "I can see the head," Matthew said suddenly, his voice cracking with emotion he had not expected. "Clara, your baby is almost here, just a little more. You are doing so well." With a final, primal scream that seemed to shake the very walls, Clara pushed with everything she had left. Matthew's hands were there, steady and sure, as the baby slipped into the world in a rush of fluid and blood. For one terrible moment, the infant was silent and blue, and Matthew's heart stopped. Then he remembered what he had seen done with lambs, and he cleared the baby's mouth and nose with his finger, rubbing the tiny back vigorously with a cloth. The baby's first cry was the most beautiful sound Matthew had ever heard. "It is a boy," he said, his voice thick with tears he did not bother to hide. "Clara, you have a son." He wrapped the baby in the cleanest cloth he could find and placed the tiny, squirming bundle in Clara's arms. The look on her face, that mixture of exhaustion and wonder and fierce, immediate love, was something Matthew knew he would remember for the rest of his life. She was beautiful, he realized suddenly. Not just pretty, but truly beautiful, with her dark eyes shining and her hair a wild tangle and her entire being focused on the new life she held. "Hello, little one," Clara whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand with one finger. The infant's fingers curled around hers immediately, and she let out a sob that was half laugh. "Hello, my sweet boy, I am your mama, I have you now, you are safe." Matthew tended to the afterbirth, with the same calm efficiency he had shown through the whole ordeal, though he was shaking now that the immediate crisis had passed. He cleaned up as best he could, found more blankets to tuck around Clara and the baby, and put more wood on the fire to keep the cabin warm. The storm still raged outside, and there was no sign of Clara's husband returning. "Thank you," Clara said softly, looking up at Matthew with eyes that held a depth of gratitude words could not express. "You saved our lives, both of us. I do not even know how to begin to thank you." Matthew pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down heavily, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. "You do not need to thank me. I just did what anyone would have done." "No," Clara said firmly. "No, you did what a good man would do, what a brave man would do. My own husband ran away, but you stayed. You stayed with a stranger and helped me through the most frightening thing I have ever faced." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm and the baby's soft, snuffling sounds as he tried to nurse. Matthew showed Clara how to help the baby latch, drawing on his experience with newborn animals, and he was surprised at how natural it felt to be here, in this small cabin, helping this woman care for her child. "Where do you think your husband is?" Matthew asked finally, though he already suspected the answer. Clara's face tightened with an emotion Matthew could not quite read. Hurt, certainly. Anger, but also something like resignation. "I do not think he went for the doctor at all," she said quietly. "I think he panicked and he ran. Richard has always been weak when things get difficult. I just did not want to believe he would abandon me like this." Matthew felt anger flare in his chest, hot and fierce. What kind of man left his wife in labor during a blizzard? What kind of coward abandoned the woman who depended on him most? "When the storm clears, I will go look for him," he said. "Make sure he is safe at least." But Clara was shaking her head. "Do not bother. If he comes back, he comes back. If he does not, well." She looked down at her son, and something hardened in her expression, something strong and determined. "This little one and I will be just fine without him." The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days during which Matthew was stranded in the cabin with Clara and her newborn son. 3 days that changed the course of all their lives. He cared for Clara as she recovered, bringing her water and the food he found in the small pantry, keeping the fire going, checking on her and the baby through the long, dark nights. He fixed the loose board on the door that let in drafts, repaired the broken chair leg that had been propped against the wall, and chopped enough wood to see them through another week of cold. And he talked to Clara. Or rather, they talked to each other. The kind of deep, honest conversations that only seem to happen when the world has shrunk to a single warm room, and there is nothing to do but be present with another human being. Matthew learned that Clara was 22 years old, that she had married Richard Dawson when she was 19 because her father had died, and she needed someone to help run the homestead. She had thought Richard would grow into responsibility, that marriage and a family would give him purpose. She had been wrong. Clara learned that Matthew was 32, that he had never married because ranch life was hard and lonely, and no woman had ever seemed interested in sharing it with him. He had a small spread of his own now, 50 acres about 10 miles east where he was building a herd slowly but surely. He was good with his hands, good with animals, and better with silence than with words, though Clara was discovering he had plenty of words when he chose to use them. On the second night, when the baby woke crying and would not settle, Matthew walked the floor with the tiny bundle against his broad chest, humming an old song his mother used to sing. Clara watched from the bed, her heart doing something complicated and unexpected in her chest. This stranger, this cowboy who had stumbled into her life by chance, was showing her son more tenderness than the baby's own father ever had. On the third day, the storm finally broke. The wind died, the snow stopped falling, and a weak winter sun emerged to shine on a world buried in white. Matthew dug a path to the small barn, checking on his horse and the 2 cows and handful of chickens Clara kept. Everything had survived, though it had been a close thing. "I should go," Matthew said when he came back inside, stamping snow off his boots. He did not look at Clara as he said it, and his voice sounded strange, reluctant. "The trail will be clear enough now. You probably want your privacy back." Clara felt panic rise in her throat. The thought of being alone again, of facing whatever came next without Matthew's steady presence, terrified her in a way even the storm had not. "Please," she said, and her voice broke. "Please do not go yet. Just a few more hours. I am still so weak, and if something happened to the baby, if he got sick or I did something wrong." It was a flimsy excuse, and they both knew it. Clara was recovering well and the baby was healthy and strong, but Matthew nodded immediately, relief clear on his face. "Of course. I will stay as long as you need me." He stayed the rest of that day and through another night. Richard did not come back. No one came. It was as if the storm had erased the rest of the world, leaving only the 3 of them in their small, warm bubble of existence. It was on the 4th morning, when Matthew was finally saddling his horse to leave, that Clara said the words that had been building in her heart. "I do not want you to go." Matthew's hand stilled on the cinch. Slowly, he turned to face her. Clara stood in the doorway of the cabin, wrapped in a shawl against the cold, the baby sleeping in her arms. She looked small and vulnerable and absolutely fierce all at once. "Clara," Matthew said carefully, "you are married. Your husband will come back eventually, and when he does, I will tell him the truth," Clara interrupted. "That he abandoned me when I needed him most, that another man delivered his child and cared for his family while he ran away, that I want a divorce." Matthew's eyes widened. Divorce was scandalous, especially in small communities like Idaho City. Women who divorced their husbands were often ostracized, considered fallen or sinful. "Clara, you do not know what you are saying. The scandal, the way people will talk, I do not care," Clara said fiercely. "I do not care what anyone says. I will not spend the rest of my life with a coward, raising my son to think that is what a man should be. These past 4 days with you, I have seen what a real man looks like. Someone brave and kind and steady. Someone who stays when things get hard instead of running away." Matthew crossed the distance between them in long strides, and for a moment Clara thought he might kiss her. Instead, he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch so gentle it made her want to weep. "You deserve that," he said softly. "You deserve someone who will never leave you, who will stand by you through everything. I just never thought I could be that man for anyone." "You already are," Clara whispered. "You have been since the moment you walked through that door." They stood there for a long moment, the winter sun bright on the snow around them, the baby warm between them. Then Matthew smiled, a real smile that transformed his whole face, and Clara felt her heart settle into a certainty she had never experienced before. "I will go into town," Matthew said. "I will ask around about your husband, see if anyone has seen him, and I will talk to a lawyer about what needs to happen for you to file for divorce. Then, if you still want me to, I will come back." "When will you come back?" Clara asked, trying not to sound as desperate as she felt. Matthew's smile widened. "Tomorrow. I will come back tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that, for as long as you will have me." He kept his word. Matthew rode into Idaho City that afternoon and discovered that Richard Dawson had indeed made it to town during the storm. He had holed up in the saloon, drinking himself into oblivion, and telling anyone who would listen that his wife and baby had surely died in the blizzard. He had not even tried to get a doctor. He had simply run and kept running, and when Matthew confronted him in the street the next day, Richard did not even have the decency to look ashamed. She was screaming, Richard said, his hands shaking as he lit a cigarette. All that blood and the screaming. I could not stand it. I just needed to get away. You needed to get away, Matthew repeated slowly, and the contempt in his voice made Richard flinch. Your wife needed you and you ran. Do you even care if they survived? Something flickered in Richard's eyes, guilt maybe, but it was quickly buried under defensiveness. Of course I care, but Clara is strong. She probably managed fine without me. No thanks to you, Matthew said. And you should know she is planning to divorce you. She wants nothing more to do with a man who would abandon her like that. Richard's face went red, then white. She cannot do that. What will people say? Your family is alive and well and wants nothing to do with you, Matthew cut him off. Sign the papers when they come. Do not make this harder than it needs to be, and stay away from that homestead. If I catch you anywhere near Clara or her son, you and I are going to have a serious problem. Richard must have seen something in Matthew's eyes that convinced him, because he nodded quickly and scurried away. Matthew watched him go with disgust, then turned and headed for the lawyer's office. Idaho Territory had only become a territory in 1863, and the laws were still relatively flexible, especially in cases of abandonment. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed man named Collins, assured Matthew that Clara would have no trouble obtaining a divorce under the circumstances. Matthew bought supplies before he left town, things Clara would need for herself and the baby. Cloth for diapers, a cradle someone was selling, sugar and flour and coffee. He loaded everything onto a small wagon he purchased with most of the money he had saved, hitched his horse to it, and drove back through the snow to the little homestead that already felt more like home than anywhere he had ever lived. Clara was standing in the window when he arrived, and the smile that lit her face when she saw him made every cold mile worth it. Matthew unloaded the supplies and told her everything that had happened in town, watching her face carefully for any sign of regret or hesitation. He saw none. If anything, Clara looked relieved. So it is really over, she said softly, sitting by the fire with the baby in her arms. My marriage, such as it was. It is over, Matthew confirmed. In 6 months, maybe less, you will be free, legally and completely free. Clara looked up at him, her dark eyes serious. And you will wait. Even though people will talk, even though it will be difficult. Matthew knelt beside her chair, taking her free hand in both of his. Clara, I have been waiting my whole life for someone like you without even knowing it. 6 months is nothing. I will wait as long as it takes. And he did. Matthew moved his small herd to the land adjacent to Clara's homestead and built a simple cabin there, close enough to help but far enough to preserve propriety. Every day he came to check on Clara and the baby, bringing fresh meat from his hunts, milk from his cow, firewood he had chopped. He repaired the roof before the next storm, built a proper chicken coop, and started planning improvements to the homestead for spring. The baby, whom Clara had named Thomas after her father, thrived under their combined care. Matthew was enchanted by the tiny human, amazed at how quickly Thomas grew and changed. He was there for the baby's first smile, the first time those little fingers wrapped around his thumb with real intent. He carved a rattle from a piece of pine and sanded it smooth, and Thomas's delighted laughter, when he shook it, was a sound Matthew wanted to hear every day for the rest of his life. Clara healed from the birth, her strength returning gradually. And as winter slowly gave way to early spring, as the snow melted and the first green shoots began to appear, something else grew between her and Matthew. It was more than gratitude, more than friendship, though it contained both those things. It was love, real and deep and undeniable. They were careful not to give the gossips more ammunition than necessary. Matthew never stayed past dark, never came into the cabin when Clara was not fully dressed. But there were moments, small and precious, when their hands would touch and linger, when their eyes would meet across the room and something electric would pass between them. Once, when Matthew was holding Thomas and the baby fell asleep against his chest, Clara leaned in to adjust the blanket and found herself so close to Matthew that she could feel his breath on her cheek. They stayed like that for a heartbeat, 2, 3, and then Clara pulled back, her face flushed and her heart racing. "Soon," Matthew said softly, and it was both a promise and a prayer. The divorce papers came through in late April, just as the wildflowers were starting to bloom across the meadows. Richard had signed without contest, apparently having fled Idaho entirely to avoid the shame. Clara held the official document in her hands and felt nothing but relief. That part of her life was over. A new one was beginning. Matthew proposed that very evening in the simple, honest way that was so essentially him. He did not have a ring, but he had a piece of silver he had been working in the evenings, shaping and polishing until it shone. "It is not much," he said, slipping it onto her finger. "But I wanted you to have something from me. Clara, I love you. I have loved you since the night I delivered your son and saw how brave and strong you are. I will spend every day of my life trying to be worthy of you. Will you marry me?" Clara was crying, but they were happy tears, joyful tears. "You are already worthy of me," she said. "You have been from the start. Yes, Matthew. Yes, I will marry you." They were wed in early May in a simple ceremony at the small church in Idaho City. Some people whispered, of course. Some said it was too soon, that Clara had probably been carrying on with Matthew even while married to Richard. But most people, when they saw the way Matthew looked at Clara, the way he held little Thomas as if the boy were his own son, understood that this was something real and good. Clara wore a simple blue dress she had made herself, with wildflowers in her hair. Matthew wore his best shirt and vest, his boots polished to a shine. Thomas, now 5 months old, gurgled happily in the arms of the preacher's wife during the ceremony. When Matthew kissed his bride, there were tears in his eyes, and Clara felt her heart swell so large she thought it might burst. They combined the two homesteads into one, living in the original cabin while Matthew worked to expand it. He built on 2 new rooms, one for Thomas and one for the future children they both hoped for. He reinforced the barn, added a proper smokehouse, and fenced in pasture for the growing herd. Clara planted a large garden, started a flock of laying hens, and began selling butter and eggs in town to bring in extra money. Life was not easy. Homesteading in Idaho Territory in the 1870s was backbreaking work, full of long days and constant challenges. But Clara and Matthew faced it all together, partners in every sense of the word. When a late frost threatened the garden, they covered the tender plants together in the pre-dawn darkness. When a mountain lion threatened the herd, Matthew sat up all night with his rifle while Clara kept hot coffee coming. When Thomas fell ill with a fever that terrified them both, they took turns sitting up with him, bathing his little body in cool water until the fever finally broke. Through it all, their love deepened. Matthew had never imagined he could feel this way about anyone, this bone-deep certainty that he had found his place in the world. Clara marveled at how different this marriage was from her first. Matthew asked her opinion on decisions, listened to her ideas, respected her thoughts. When they disagreed, they talked it through until they found a solution together. And at night, when Thomas was asleep and the cabin was quiet, they would lie in each other's arms and talk about their dreams for the future. Thomas grew into a sturdy, happy toddler who called Matthew Papa, without hesitation. Matthew never tried to replace the boy's biological father, but he loved Thomas as completely as if the child had been born to him. He taught the boy to whistle, to identify bird calls, to be gentle with the animals. Clara would watch them together, her husband and her son, and feel grateful beyond words for the night of the storm that had brought them all together. 2 years after their marriage, Clara gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret, with Matthew's steady hands bringing her into the world just as he had done with Thomas. The birth was easier this time, or perhaps it just seemed that way because Clara was not alone and terrified. She had Matthew beside her, encouraging her, supporting her, and when their daughter let out her first lusty cry, the look of pure wonder on his face made Clara fall in love with him all over again. Thomas was delighted with his baby sister, wanting to help with everything. He would bring her his favorite toys, sing to her the songs Matthew had taught him, and pat her head with a gentleness that belied his 3 years. Matthew built a cradle far finer than anything they could have bought, carved with flowers and horses and mountains. At night, they would take turns rocking Margaret to sleep, and sometimes Clara would wake to find Matthew standing over the cradle, just watching their daughter with an expression of such tender protectiveness it made her throat tight. The homestead prospered. By 1879, they had 60 head of cattle, 24 horses including several fine breeding mares, and a thriving vegetable and grain operation. Matthew's reputation as an honest dealer and skilled horseman spread throughout the territory, and people came from miles around to buy stock from him. Clara's butter and preserves were in high demand in Idaho City, and she had started a small mail-order business selling seeds and starter plants. They were well respected in the community now. The scandal of Clara's divorce and quick remarriage had long since faded, replaced by admiration for the couple who worked so hard and loved each other so obviously. The Reeves homestead was known as a place of hospitality, where travelers could find a hot meal and a place to rest. Clara never forgot what it felt like to be desperate and afraid, and she made sure no one who came to their door left without help. In the spring of 1880, Clara discovered she was pregnant again. This time there was no fear, only joy and anticipation. Matthew was beside himself with excitement, already planning where to build another room onto the cabin. Thomas, now nearly 4 years old, announced importantly that he was going to teach the new baby everything important. Margaret, toddling around at 1.5 years, seemed to sense the excitement even if she did not understand it. Their son was born on a bright June morning, an easy birth that had Matthew laughing with relief and Clara crying with happiness. They named him Joseph, and he had his father's dark hair and his mother's eyes. Thomas and Margaret crowded close to meet their new brother, and Matthew held all 3 children in his strong arms, looking at Clara with such love she felt blessed beyond measure. That evening, when the children were asleep and the cabin was quiet, Matthew and Clara sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. Matthew's arm was around Clara's shoulders, and she leaned into his warmth, feeling utterly content. "Did you ever imagine this?" Clara asked softly. "That night during the storm, did you have any idea where it would lead?" Matthew was quiet for a moment, thinking. "No," he said finally. "I thought I was just helping someone in need. I never imagined I would find everything I ever wanted in that cabin. A wife I adore, children I would die for, a home that feels like it was always meant to be mine." Clara turned to look up at him, this man who had stumbled into her life during the worst moment of it and stayed to make every moment after better. "You saved my life that night," she said. "But you did more than that. You gave me a reason to believe in good men again. You showed me what real love looks like." Matthew kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "You gave me a family," he said. "You gave me a purpose beyond just surviving." Every day with you and our children is a gift I never expected to receive." They sat together as the stars came out, making plans for the future. Matthew wanted to buy the adjacent property and expand their operation. Clara wanted to build a schoolhouse on their land for Thomas and the other children in the area. They talked about growing old together, about watching their children grow up and have children of their own, about building something that would last for generations. The years rolled on, full and rich. Thomas grew into a capable young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did. Margaret, sweet and practical like her mother, had a gift for growing things and took over the garden operations. Joseph, the baby, turned out to have a way with horses that amazed even Matthew. More children came, 2 more daughters and another son, until the cabin had been expanded so many times it barely resembled the tiny homestead where it all began. Idaho Territory became a state in 1890, and Matthew and Clara voted together in the first election, still partners in everything. The ranch was now one of the most successful in the region, but they never forgot their humble beginnings. Clara still took in travelers who needed help, and Matthew still delivered calves and foals for neighbors who needed his expertise. They never forgot that terrible, wonderful night of the storm either. Every year on the anniversary, Clara would tell the story to their children and eventually their grandchildren. She never left out the hard parts, the fear and pain and betrayal. But she always ended with how Matthew had appeared like an answer to a prayer she had not even known how to say, how he had stayed when anyone else would have run, how he had chosen her and her son when he could have walked away. Matthew would hold her hand while she told the story, and sometimes his eyes would grow misty thinking about that scared young woman and her newborn son, about how close he had come to riding right past the cabin that night. One wrong turn, one different decision, and he would have missed the greatest blessing of his life. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1902, their children threw them a party that brought together half the county. Thomas and his wife had given them 4 grandchildren already. Margaret was engaged to the son of a neighboring rancher. Joseph was working on breeding a line of horses that showed real promise. The younger children were all thriving, growing into fine young people who knew they were loved beyond measure. As the party wound down and guests began to leave, Matthew and Clara slipped away to their favorite spot on the porch. The mountains were purple in the fading light, and the air smelled like pine and wild roses. Clara's hair was streaked with gray now, and lines crinkled around Matthew's eyes when he smiled, but when they looked at each other, they saw the young people they had been when they first met. "I would do it all again," Clara said softly. "Every hard moment, every struggle, just to end up right here with you." Matthew pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder just as she had done 1,000 times before. "I thank God for that storm," he said. "For every snowflake that fell, for every gust of wind that blew me to your door. It was the worst night of your life, and it was the beginning of mine." They sat together as the stars came out, just as they had done so many times over the years. Inside the house, they could hear their children and grandchildren laughing and talking, the sound of family and love and belonging. The ranch stretched out around them, prosperous and thriving, a testament to years of hard work and partnership. Clara thought about the girl she had been, abandoned and terrified during a blizzard, certain she would die alone. She thought about how that same night had brought her Matthew, steady and brave and kind, everything she had needed without knowing it. And she thought about all the years since, all the joy and sorrow and ordinary moments that had woven together to create a life richer than any she could have imagined. "I love you," she said, the words as true now as they had been on their wedding day, as true as they would be on their last day together, whenever that might come. "I love you too," Matthew answered, and kissed her as the first stars of evening lit up the Idaho sky. They had been given an unexpected beginning in the middle of a storm, and they had turned it into a love story that would echo through generations. Their children would tell their children about the cowboy who delivered a baby during a blizzard and stayed forever, about the woman who had the courage to choose real love over comfortable lies. It became a family legend, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best things, that courage comes in many forms, and that true love is worth fighting for. Matthew and Clara lived many more years together, growing old on the land they had built into something beautiful. When Matthew finally passed away in 1918 at the age of 74, Clara held his hand and whispered that she would see him again soon. She followed him less than a year later, and they were buried side by side on a hill overlooking their ranch, where the mountains met the sky and the wind sang through the pines. Their descendants kept the ranch running for generations after, and the story of how it all began never faded. It was told at family gatherings and written down in journals, a testament to the kind of love that endures through every storm. The original cabin was preserved and still stood on the property over a century later, a small structure that housed the beginning of something vast and lasting. Sometimes, on winter nights when the snow fell heavy and the wind howled, people swore they could see two figures on the porch of that old cabin, holding each other close and watching the storm together. Whether it was memory or magic or just imagination, it seemed fitting. After all, a love like theirs, born in blizzard and sealed in courage, was the kind that could weather anything, even the boundaries between one life and the next. The ranch still bore the Reeves name, still stood strong and proud against the Idaho mountains. And every generation that worked the land and loved beneath that endless sky knew the truth that Matthew and Clara had proved with their lives, that real love does not run when things get hard. It stays. It endures. It builds something that lasts forever.